Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. Let's get this started, shall we? All right, so welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the 14th Salem Lit Fest. I'm Alexis, a member of the wonderful team of volunteers and Salem Athenaeum and Salem Public Library staff who bring you this festival each year. And before we begin today's program, we really want to acknowledge that Salem is on the ancestral territory of the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Massachusetts, Namkeg, and Agawam. Many other Indigenous communities have lived and moved through this land over hundreds of years, and many Indigenous people work and live in these regions today. We take this moment to honor these ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the rights and liberation of all Indigenous peoples worldwide. I'm very pleased to introduce this session, Fantasy Writing Across the Genre. But before I introduce our authors, I want to give you a quick overview of how this will all work. We've pasted our anti-harassment policy at the top of the chat, or will shortly if it's not there, so you know the rules up front. And we don't anticipate any problems from you book lovers, but we also want you to know how important it is to us to keep everyone feeling safe. Most of you are Zoom experts by now, thanks to COVID, so just a few quick tips. Put your questions in the Q&A and we will do our best to answer them after the authors have finished their conversation. Any extraneous comments can be put in the chat, though we'd appreciate you keep the chat to a minimum to avoid distracting our authors. If you'd like to use closed captioning, just click the box that says CC at the bottom of your screen. Awesome, thank you, Carolyn, for putting that in the chat. And now to introduce our presenters. Piper CJ has an MA in folklore and a BA in broadcasting. She is the author of the USA Today and Barnes & Noble best-selling adult fantasy series, The Night and Its Moon by Bloom Books, and a member of the LGBTQIA+ community. When she isn't playing with her dogs Arrow and Applesauce, she's making TikToks for her 1 million+ followers, studying fairy tales, or creating worlds. Joseph Samaniego is a historian from North Carolina specializing in medieval European history. He holds a Master of Arts in History and has a future plan to receive a PhD. In his daily life, he is not only a fantasy author with multiple titles to his credit, he also writes nonfiction and is a fantasy cartographer. When he is not spending time with his family, Joseph spends time reading, writing, and playing video games. And last but not least, Meg Smitherman writes romantic stories about magic and world-ending stakes. Based in LA, she shares her life with a chihuahua, a cat, and a handsome Englishman, which really just sounds like the goals for all of us. All right, well, let's pop in, fantasy authors. So the first question I have for you all is fantasy spans so many different subgenres. It's such a exciting and interesting world that we all get to inhabit. So can you discuss your choice of subgenre within the fantasy realm and what drew you to it?
Sure, just pop in.
Go ahead.
Great. I started with high fantasy because you can make up any rules you want in high fantasy. It's your world, your god. In urban fantasy, which I've also enjoyed playing with for future installments, it's more like a sandbox where you have a fixed set of toys to play with, and then you can bring some of your own. But the nice thing about high fantasy is that there are really no wrong answers as long as you're consistent. What do you guys think?
I definitely started with the high fantasy, epic fantasy, sort of along the lines of just what I had always read as a kid, reading Tolkien or reading Howard's works or even Burroughs, and just kind of going from there and letting that influence kind of go through. But then when I started writing for my history thesis, it kind of helped me to explore and branch out some. But now I've even gone further. My more recent novel was kind of bending the lines between high fantasy and just something more surreal, something that was a lot more imaginative, but still with the same idea of as long as you can keep it consistent. That's just kind of how I kind of view it as well.
It started with high fantasy too. I think we all have like a Tolkien background.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like the elves and like the magical world. And you already have like that set of rules in place, but then you can like break them. But I've always really liked like Jane Austen and sort of like Victorian literature. So I think a lot of my fantasy worlds are like shaped by that. So like I really like to write fantasy worlds that are kind of more like 1800s or 17th century. So people wearing like cravats and like having tea. That's my spin on fantasy.
And who doesn't love to have tea and also potentially have like tea with Tolkien, right? Sort of seems like the overall theme of this panel, which I love. So speaking of sort of your subgenre, that really I think leads in well to world building, which is sort of at the cornerstone of all fantasy novels. You're creating these beautiful worlds that we get to exist in. So how do you do it? How do you build your world?
In The Night and Its Moon, I think it was really nice to start from a place of ignorance, so I didn't have to info dump because the characters were learning as children. And so as they had natural or organic questions, the readers could have answers to those questions as well as they came up, rather than the opening chapter to just being like that TikTok audio. And then you went to where all of the people from the capital for the last 700 years. The ignorance has been a great tool, but I don't always want to use children to facilitate that. So even if you are starting with an adult, like one of my upcoming series, you can still be ignorant about the topic and then ask organic questions rather than info dump. But sometimes info dumping is the best way to go about it.
Yeah, just coming from that history background, info dump for me is very welcoming. You know, I love that. I love that when I'm watching a movie and you have that whole 10 minutes of backstory or even reading a book. I know that not a lot of people like that, but for me, you know, writing history for research purposes, they always tell you, you want to put your historiography in the front, which is, yeah, academically that's proper, but for people who are reading it because they want to learn more, you want to put that at the end because that's the boring stuff for a lot of people. But for me, that's the exciting stuff because that's where it all came from. So I try to have, I definitely try to do a lot of the world building up front, but then with each book, I just delve deeper because I had a book recently that the main character became a mercenary, and she was supposed to be in her mind, she was the rightful princess to the throne, heir to the throne, but because she was illegitimate, she wasn't going to get it without winning it, so she became a mercenary. And so it took her to a lot of other areas that I had never explored in my books, but now I got to explore them and I got to create them. And it's fun for that because then you get to build your own history. So if you love history and you love cultures and you love just delving into things like that, now you get to do that and kind of make your own rules about it. And again, as long as you're just remembering what you wrote and remembering what you thought about, that's kind of the fun part.
Yeah. I like to think of world building, or I like to think of the setting and the world as its own character. So like I really only talk about the aspects of it that serve the story. And like I like to reveal parts of the world the story progresses so that I don't think my books are super heavy on world building, but when it happens, it's always kind of like just woven into the narrative. But there's always like a lot going on in my head, or like I have a lot of stuff written down that never makes it into the book, and then I will get like confused when people are like, "Why did this happen?" I'm like, "Well, because of this." Oh wait, that's world building that I didn't actually put in the book. But yeah, I think for me, it's like always organic with the narrative, and like I come up with the characters and the story first, and then the world kind of like forms around them.
Awesome. Thank you all. So this sort of leads in to my next question is, many of you have your own unique special interests outside of writing, like folklore and history and cartography. So how do you incorporate those special interests into your writing?
obviously I use folklore to inform everything that I've put into the books. And in high fantasy, I've gotten to play with that a little bit. We'll take something like succubus lore. And how would that look if it were played out in what feels like a real world environment, but in something that I've created? In other series, I get to use folklore in a today setting, and how that would look in our modern age with TikTok and cell phones and how all of those things would look. But I think the folklore background has been, this is really the only way it's useful. Unless you're writing fantasy, I don't recommend getting the degree. But it's been integral for me.
Yeah, kind of along those same lines of my history degree, honestly. So when I'm for my book, so if anybody's ever read any of my books, the one or two people out there, I would say that the narrator is a historian, and he's telling these stories as he would either to youngsters or maybe perhaps to an audience, but he's a historian speaking of what happened 1,000 years ago in this land. That's how I wrote him, in the sense that, I guess people say Tom Bombadil was Tolkien, so to speak. Well, the narrator is me. And here, this is me telling you the story of this magical fantasy land that happened so long ago. I created the maps because of the fact that I have researched these people, these cultures. And so now my character is the narrator. And as cheesy as that may sound, for me, that's how I see it as the narrator is the character who is telling some little prince or princess these like bedtime stories, of their history, so to speak. So that's how I use, I guess, my gift of knowledge of history and cartography into my books.
Awesome.
So cool. I feel like I don't have any special knowledge or skills. I don't have any special interests. I guess the only thing I could think of is I really love the concept of like, this is very specific to my book Destroyer, but I really love the concept of like any technology that's sufficiently advanced is like indecipherable from magic, or whatever the quote is. But I really like that idea. And so like the concept of magic is very important to me. And I think it's real, but maybe not in the way that like Tolkien would have talked about it. But that's like a big theme in Destroyer, is just like technology and magic, and like the main character is an archaeologist, which I really like archaeology based on like Stargate and Indiana Jones. So I know all about it. But yeah, I think those were like just some vague interests of mine that I like wove into the book, and hopefully did an okay job of conveying. I didn't really do a lot of research on archaeology, just to let you know in advance. So don't expect that, but it inspired it.
I think watching Indiana Jones is sufficient research for
You
your
pretty much have a degree.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, that actually leads me into another question for you all about magic. So each of you have magic in your books in some regard that are very unique from each other. So magic systems can get really complex in novels, and you have to strive to be consistent, and that can be really challenging. So tell us a little bit about the creation of your version of magic in your novel.
Well, like you had said, consistency truly is the only thing that matters. The reader is willing to suspend disbelief and be along for the ride, as long as you don't break the rules that you've created. So if you say that everyone in your kingdom sweats fire, whatever, that's how it is. That's not in my book, but then make sure that you follow through on that. I enjoyed using kind of established magics from folk stories, but then the way that I've implemented them and amplified them comes from other tales and inspirations as well. But when you're writing high fantasy, you can really do whatever you want as long as you stick to your guns.
Yeah. I would say I broke that rule recently of the consistency. So I did the whole traditional, this is magic, it's very elemental, it's very, elves are magical. There's this whole race of beings that are created from magic personified, basically. And they have to speak this oath. Otherwise, the magic will either overwhelm them or they'll become bigger than what they, more powerful than what they really need to be. But then as I was writing my most recent book, I decided I wanted to get more complicated. And so the magic system changed. And now that there were beings long before, the old gods who supposedly give power, but they actually corrupt. And these other beings are like, everything gets corrupted. And so mortals lost their way of magic. And so like now there's no rules of magic. It's like they have to these small groups who know the truth have to now rebuild everything. So I guess in a sense, I liked how I was doing it, but then I was like, I just want to do something different. So now the magic it's almost like the threads of the universe. Like everything it's almost like a thread. In the book I'm working on now, I actually mentioned how the antagonist plucked at the air as if she was plucking at lute strings, and they could hear the tones echoing off the walls, because that's the magic. She was able to pull the magic like that from the universe around us. So I'm kind of expanding it, but at the same time, I'm learning it myself.
Yeah.
Really cool. I love plucking the strings of magic. My books don't have a lot of magic in terms of like people using it. I purposely created like a fantasy world where most of the people in the world don't actually believe in magic. And that's kind of like the protagonist's central problem is that she believes in magic. She wrote like a whole scientific paper on it trying to like prove that it exists, but it was kind of a terrible paper and everyone's like, you're a laughing stock. And then she actually discovers this like magical artifact. And so it's more like the magic only exists in this one object, and she's the only one who really sort of like believes that it's magic. And that was a difficult thing, I think, because like they said, consistency is really important, and I had to like be consistent in how she interacted with this like one magical object, even though like no one else around her saw it and believed what was going on. So yeah, it's a very different type of magic, but still difficult to write, I found.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, magic is so hard. And you all do such a great job of showing it in different ways, which is something I love about all of your books. And this sort of leads me well into your next question about characters. So you all have incredibly complex characters with do you want to make but that's Joseph's daughter, by the way. She just got back from a road trip, so she's hungry. She needs to eat. But all have these beautifully complex characters that have so much depth to them, and are so unique. So really, how do you go about crafting these really relatable, complex characters? And are there any archetypes that you really try to subvert or explore in your work with your characters?
Yeah. So one of my favorite things about writing is I'm a pantser as opposed to a plotter. So I don't really plot the books. I might maybe write a paragraph of unhinged vibes. And what I do figure out is the characters in their entirety and then let them react to stimuli the way that they would organically. And what that means for some of my characters, like Nox, who's one of the two protagonists in The Night and Its Moon, she's not going to pick up a sword. If I am dropped in a fantasy world, you can't make me fight. I am not going to be an athlete. So I liked having a character who is able to fight with brains and beauty instead of just in a conventional combat scenario. And then what fantasy world, particularly written by men, doesn't have a brothel? So being able to include sex worker representation, not as a throwaway, like as a device for exposition or as a way for the character to find himself or someone to save, even worse, God forbid, but that is a part of her power and what makes her so empowered and special. So those are some of my favorite things about the character and subversion of typical tropes. But I know I'm not the only one who's done this. So what do you guys have?
I think I did something similar. Well, not similar, but there's so many heroines in fantasy who are like badass and like fight with swords, and they're like, that's their whole thing. And I love that. But I was like, what if we wrote about a nerd who's afraid of public speaking and like just wants to read a bunch of books and like write scientific papers? So that's what I wrote. And I always find myself putting like my own flaws in my characters. So that's kind of one of the ways that I try to make them like real and believable is like, well, this one will have anxiety. This one will make jokes at really awkward times. Like, so I think you kind of have to, or it's impossible not to kind of put yourself into your characters in a way, because that's kind of like all you know of being in someone's head is your own head. But yeah, that's probably why I write a lot of nerdy losers.
Losers.
They're not losers.
No.
They're interesting and well thought out characters.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the biggest things I like to have the antagonists be relatable to the point of this isn't, I like the idea of, okay, I just want to watch the world burn antagonist. Like there's no reason for my evil. It's just, it's evil. But at the same time, I do like the characters that have a sort of, when they have a reason, they were hurt or they were betrayed. But then also my protagonist, they can't be perfect, obviously. No one wants a perfect protagonist. So the more recent one, she was fighting inner demons. And I was actually at the time going through a lot of anxiety. Excuse me, my voice, I'm getting over kind of a chest cold or something. But I was going through a lot of anxiety, still am, but a lot of other things. And so I was putting a lot of that stuff in my characters kind of as well, what I was going through. And it made this character who had to not only battle these outward forces, but she's also battling these things within herself. And she's having to fight within her own mind, what's real, what's not real, what is going on and what is shaping her. And at the same time, the fate of the mortal world hinges in the balance, as it always does in these books for some reason. There's always something. And I think I even mentioned that in one book, was like, there's always like, can we ever just have a 1 week where there's not like the world ending? So, and that kind of brings us to the other thing, is you have to have a break from it, for a break from the reality, and have that humor. And someone's obviously having humor right now, but have that humor in your life, and at the same time be able to kind of decompress.
Absolutely. And this actually, there's a great question in the chat put forth by Connor that I think is a really good segue to this. So we just talked about how great all of our characters are, but do you have a least favorite character that you've written? And what about that character are you like that you don't like? And this can be like, you don't like them because they're bad, or there's something about them that just like irks you, or it can be like, gosh, I really did not nail, it didn't come out the way I wanted it to. So interpret that as you will. But
people hate my answer. My least favorite character in the Night and Its Moon series is one of the dual protagonists. I don't like Amaris that much. She has the emotional intelligence of a cucumber, which is intentional. She wasn't given the opportunity to socialize. And then when she was around people, it was in this very gruff, like, keep your feelings to yourself environment. So when she's finally meant to be a human and talk to people, she's fucking up a lot. She's dropping the ball when it comes to emotional intelligence. And that's frustrating, but it's also honest to her character. And she's young. So having someone be an idiot it's easy to be frustrated with her. As far as my villains, I feel like people are rarely evil in a vacuum. Like true psychopathy is so rare. So I like to present them as the way we would see them, which is very evil. And then eventually you learn their backstory and you're like, how dare you make me be sympathetic for this monster? But yeah, that's my favorite or least favorite.
Wow, I love Amaris.
I know everyone does.
I love that though. And you're right. You are absolutely right. No emotional intelligence, but she is a fascinating character.
Thank you.
I think my least favorite is she's the antagonist of two of my books. She's Iodok. She's the they call her the Queen of the Dead. And she basically is a priestess of one of the old gods who is the god of the dead. And it's not that I don't like her necessarily. I just didn't like the direction I was going with her. And then I didn't set it. I felt like because I wrote some books out of order, I've set it up kind of wonky. So now I have to find the right place to reintroduce her back into it, because I want her, because as the antagonist, she's really the ultimate antagonist. And I want her back, but I'm not sure how the best way to go about that. And so I feel like I wrote myself into a rabbit hole not rabbit hole, but like into a corner with her.
This is a hard question for me to answer. I think the only character I really dislike that I've written is from the sequel to Destroyer, so I'm not going to say her name, but I give her like these motivations and like a backstory that I think other people will find very sympathetic and like empathize with and be like, oh man, I see why she did these terrible things. But I personally I wouldn't do those things. And I think she kind of reminds me of like, she's like a Cersei Lannister type, where you're like I get it, but also like I wouldn't do that, and that's like you're the worst person ever. So it was really hard writing that type of character, because I really wanted her to have like her own motivations, and like you could really be like, okay, I can see that objectively, but also you're the worst and terrible, and I would never do that. So yeah.
I'm really glad you wouldn't act like Cersei Lannister. I think we all benefit from that. But this actually, as you were all talking, a lot of you mentioned, except for Piper, your antagonists being some of your least favorite characters, which makes a lot of sense. But where did your inspiration for your antagonists come from? They're so complex and interesting. So what made you create these often evil, spooky, mean characters?
Even my cruelest antagonist, I'm gonna just ruin everyone's day when her novella comes out and you're like, why would you do this to me? Don't make me feel bad for her. But I like all of my antagonists in The Night and Its Moon, and honestly in my upcoming series as well. I think it came from a place of empathy, perhaps in my upbringing, where I have some resentment towards some figures in my life, but I can also empathize with why they did what they did and why it was the right choice for them, considering the information that they had or their worldview, and they are acting exactly in line with what they believe is right for their worldview. So I just think that makes it for a much more interesting character when they're not black and white in terms of morality. Do I have a character that's just evil in a vacuum? Maybe one in the villain prequels, but even then, I really like my likable villains. So yeah, there are 2 books that come out after the Night and Its Moon series for the villain prequels in the Garden universe, and everybody's a villain in that one. No, I like my villains. I don't know.
I love villains. I love writing a villain. I think that's the character I talked about. She's the only one I don't like. Like the antagonist in Destroyer, he's like my favorite character I think that I've ever written. He's just kind of a smarmy, like aristocratic guy. He's the guy that will like kiss your hand at dinner, and it's kind of like it's hot, but it's also like, why are you kissing my hand? And he's very like well dressed, and he's beautiful. He kind of has the like Lestat vibe, from Interview with the Vampire, where he's like really pretty and like has really good manners, but is actually just sort of like terrible inside.
I have
But
a
in
crush
a-
on your villain.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
And his name, great name, Luke. Ugh.
Yes.
I think for my antagonist, it's always something. I think I typically start there. I typically start with like, what are they trying to do, and develop it from there. Like, how do they have to be to get what they want, to get to for their end goal? What do they have to do, and how do they have to be, and what are they willing to do? And so that's kind of where, for me, I build them up from their reasoning, and then try to develop that around them, as opposed to, I guess, them reacting. I guess everyone's reacting to them as opposed to them reacting to the world.
Very cool. So you've all did so much research, watched Indiana Jones, read a bunch of high fantasy in your lives. You probably had so much information that you wanted to cram into these beautiful books. So what are some things that didn't make it into your novels that you wish had?
So Tolkien gets flack for spending 20 pages talking about trees, and I also really like to be wordy. Like, my editor at one point called me, Piper, why use one word when there are 7 prettier words, CJ? It's so true. So when I like to really expand on things, and there are a lot of little scenes that got cut out. There was a really charming one, this lakeside farm family that got cut out of T-Name. And then in the last one, in Dawn, which comes out in January, and they've already sent me an arc for it. A lot of the ones they wanted to cut were like, it seems like everyone's really miserable here in this area. Can we like decrease the misery so the readers aren't miserable? No, misery is the point. I want them to be miserable, and I want the readers to be miserable. Everyone should be miserable. My feelings aren't always the feelings that people like best. So I, believe it or not, these thick books are cut down substantially from how thick they originally were.
Yeah.
So just lots gets trimmed from the hedges.
I haven't really left much out. When it comes to sometimes when my beta readers, there will be times that they say you can do without this or do without that. And it's just because I may get repetitive, especially with the backstory or info. So things like that. I think when I wrote in Scorned, I think that did get I did have a couple scenes get taken out just because it was putting a little bit too much onto the protagonist. It was almost like you're putting her through too much. And so now let's just bring it back a little bit. But I wanted the reader to really be behind her and behind her reasoning. Because in the folklore of the, I guess, nation that she comes from, the kingdom she comes from, hundreds of years later, she's known as a tyrant and an evil person. But here I'm showing you how she's really not. And I wanted the reader to get that, but they're like, yeah, we got it. You can take off some of this stuff.
But I think I benefit from being like indie author, and if I really like a scene, even if my editor says it should be cut, I won't cut it. But that actually hasn't happened. That's just a theoretical. I think the one thing I'm really sad that I had to cut was I put a scene in my book with donuts, and my editor said those haven't been invented till like the 1800s in real life. So it would like take the reader out of the story if you had donuts. And I was like, okay. So that's genuinely though, like I don't honestly, like if I cut anything, I will immediately forget about it and it will be gone from my brain. So I won't even miss it. It's not really a problem for me.
That's kind of beautiful, though I do mourn the loss of your character's donuts. That is definitely a tragedy. But
Thank you.
Moving a little bit more into sort of your writing as a craft, what influenced you to sit down and start writing a book?
I was two things. I frequently read and have the frustration, but why don't the girls kiss though? And so I wanted to write a bisexual fantasy series. And then I was reading a popular YA novel, and the title of which I will take to my grave. The character was very young and just the best assassin in the kingdom. Like, but how? Why? When will it be explained? What do you mean she just is the best assassin in the kingdom? So I decided I'm going to make an assassin, and she's going to be a sack of flour, and she's going to have to work for what she earns. And so reading has inspired in me spite reactions. So I write for spite. When I read something I don't like, I will have a reactionary response from like, I'm going to do it better. Or watching movies or TV or something that like, well, just would have been improved. I guess in a way I'm writing anti-fanfic of everything I read or consume.
Writing out of spite.
I just got to get the stories out of my own head. They just keep developing, and I've thought about what if I just stop writing, but then I still have the ideas and the stories in my head, and it just kind of drives me nuts to the point of like, okay, I'll just write it down. Fine, I'll just do it. I'll just write. So it's just for my own sanity.
I'm the same way. Like I can't remember a time when I wasn't just like writing books, or I didn't write a complete book until I was like in my late 20s, but like growing up as a kid, I would like start novels every week. So I'd have like a new book that I was writing constantly, and then I'd push it aside and write another one. And I think I was maybe in my teens before I realized, oh wait, this is a thing that I could like do and publish a book. So I think I was just because I loved reading, and I was like, I just want to sort of like replicate the stories that I've been reading, but in my own way. And then down the line, I was like, oh, I guess I can actually share these stories with other people and actually get good at it. So
I have one more thing to why I write. Meg and I are actually friends offline. We met on Twitter 8 or 9 years ago, and I hadn't been writing. I'd been scared straight out of writing from my father, who didn't believe it was a viable career. And Meg was the one who encouraged me to start writing again, even just in small bits. So she's like, come on, write an article for the hockey guys. We were really into hockey at the time. You can do it. Write this. And I would write the worst, like the shittiest. You remember that book I wrote like 8 years ago and I sent it to you, and you're like, huh,
it was good.
It wasn't good, but I love you. And thanks to your encouragement. Sometimes you just need one person who believes in you and who encourages you to do things and to get back into things that bring you joy. So thanks, Meg.
Oh, friendship and spite. I love it. Awesome. So you are all pretty established fantasy authors at this point. So what advice do you have for aspiring authors who are just beginning their journey?
A shitty finished draft is always better than a perfect unfinished draft. I think everyone has a book in them, and it's really easy to start a book and get 5 chapters in and then be frustrated and be caught up in that editing loop of it's not quite right yet, so they don't move forward. So I recommend that you pump out a skeleton. Just start at the head and go to the toe bones, and bare bones, get it done. And then you can go back, and as you're adding these elements, like flesh characters out, you get your muscle, you get your tissue. When you finally get to the makeup stage with your editors, that's when you can make things perfect. But to actually just finish the work is my best advice.
Yeah, I agree. Also, I think it's really important to, if there's a book that you've been working on for like years and years and you just can't get it right and it's not serving you, like set it aside and move on. I think it's really important to remember, like, the first book you ever write is probably not going to be the best one or even necessarily good or one that you want to publish and put into the world. I really think writing for practice, just writing stories, writing character, little snippets about your character, slice of life stuff, the beginning of a novel you'll never finish. I think that kind of stuff is so important, just to like get the feel of it, start, developing your style and finding what you enjoy and what you like. Like, I think a lot of people think I need to go straight from zero to writing a whole book. And that's just not the case. You don't have to do that. Take it slow. Writing, like, you can be as old as you want and write, like, this isn't Hollywood. There's no time limit. So just take your time and enjoy it and figure out what you enjoy and what you're good at. And yeah, that's my advice.
And I would say keep your eyes, your ears, and your mind open to everything around you, because what you're doing today, what you're writing about today, might not be anywhere close to what you're writing about in a year or 10 years. The first book I wrote vastly different than what I'm writing now, because my mindset has changed and the world around me has changed, and I've incorporated that because I want to have something personal in each of these books. But then also the other thing, don't be afraid of criticism or rejection, and do things to help practice, whether that's just writing for yourself, writing little fanfics, short, I say little, I mean short fanfics for yourself or for friends, or submit to anthologies, 2,000 words or less stories or something, just to keep your pen moving and your ideas going. That's what I do.
Awesome. All right, to round us out here, can you share, and I know this is very hard because some of you aren't allowed to a certain extent, but can you share any details about your current or upcoming projects that you might have, and sort of what readers can look forward to from you in the future?
I can on Wednesday. So I'm 3 days out from being able to talk about one of my projects. On the 13th, I can make a really big announcement that I'm very excited about. And that's a luxury of being indie. I'm jealous of Meg. She can decide when she wants to announce things. I have gag orders. And then hopefully next month I can talk about my soul project. So I have 2 series I'll be able to announce this fall. One is 3 days from now. But I guess I can share, they are not here. What can I share? They're both under the super umbrella that is fantasy, but they're very dissimilar to the Night in the Moon series. And they are both different subgenres, and neither of them are standalones. I think that's all. I don't know what else I can say.
That's great. And we'll all be on the lookout in literally 3 days' time for a fun announcement. That's awesome. Great timing.
Yeah.
It's so exciting.
I'm so excited.
I have the only thing that I have working on, or that I'm working on, that other than the Shattered City duology, which is Destroyer and Sanctifier, which doesn't have a release date yet, but hopefully soon. And then I'm working on a standalone fantasy romance, which is like my first foray into the true romance genre, which has been really fun. I think it's just been like a pure joyful thing, because I'm not really worried about like telling a complex narrative tale. Like there's a story there, but it's more about just like the 2 characters getting together. It's like an enemies to lovers, set in an icy world. It's set in the same world as Destroyer, like 1,000 years before Destroyer takes place. So yeah, that's really exciting. That comes out in February 6th, called The Frost Queen's Blade. So you can add it on Goodreads now. The cover is in production. So yeah, I'm excited about that.
Very fun.
So working on a couple things. The anthology that I just submitted to, or not submitted to, but was featured in, just came out from Rebellion Lit. The start, I had a story in there, which was kind of different from what I've worked on in the past, because I'm not a short story guy, but it was fun. But I'm working on the sequel to a book that I released back in February, Empty Palace. I'm working on a sequel to that, Dark Empress, which, just as a preview, the 10,000-year-old Wraith basically gets her freedom. And now she will finish what she started 10,000 years before. And I'm working on a kind of a new standalone, maybe a new series, kind of taking off a spinoff from Scorned. Rowena, the main character from Scorned, her love interest, future husband. Sorry, just for spoilers on that one, for those who actually got to the end of that one. Blackhand, he's part of the company, which is a mercenary group, slash bank, slash conglomerate, and just think medieval, style banking, mercenaries, mob, gangster type atmosphere. Working on a story about them specifically now. And it's it's simply titled The Company. And those are both going to be out, hoping spring of 2024, but writing 2 full-length novels at the same time is probably not my best idea, but we'll see.
Oh, I guess I can share dates. Yeah. So I have 3 books coming out next year. The Dawn in Its Light is the only one that y'all know about. It comes out in January. And then I've been referring to the others with emojis. So the fox emoji will come out in July of 2024. And then the plant emoji will come out fall of 2024. So that's the only other thing I can say. My angel. Shh. Can you hear her?
Oh, yeah, but it's very pleasant. I love it.
Is it pleasant?
Well, I love hearing all the exciting things that we have to look forward to from all of you. So now I figure we'll jump into some audience questions. I already did one, so skipped ahead a little bit. If you do have any questions, again, you can put them in the Q&A. But one question that someone put in is, do you have any tips for fleshing out the midsection of your plot?
Midsection. Oh, I received some really good advice at a Comic-Con panel, and it was about the id button as an id, ego, superego. The advice that she gave was, if there's a lull, if you feel bored, then your readers will probably feel bored as well. And something you can do is smash the id button. That can be something like incorporating food, have them eating, or sex. So incorporating a sexual tension or romance. But if there is a part in your book that you feel is very slow, it's never a bad idea to smash the id button.
I typically skip it and start writing the next section. What I've done in the past is, especially if I already know how the book, even though I am a pantser, I kind of know what I want later on in the book. I just got to get there. I'll go ahead and start getting that taken care of, getting that fleshed out, and then working my way back. Like, how do we get to this step? And then work backwards. And a lot of times that's helped in the past just to get past that point. Because if you're feeling bored, I totally agree. Then they're going to be bored. Because if you're not into it, why should they be? So let's skip it and get back to it.
Yeah, I struggle with this. My middles are always saggy in the first draft. But I think this is also advice that I heard from another writer and editor, is that if your story is kind of dragging and you don't really know what to do, like, how it ends and how it starts and then the middle is blah, just add something like terrible, like have someone die or have someone gravely injured, have something really terrible happen to your characters that they can't get out of, and then have them get out of it. So just sort of, add, I think she put it, I wish I could remember her name. She's on TikTok and she's an editor, and the way she puts it is just put blood on the floor.
Ooh.
So if there's like, you don't know what to do, put blood on the floor. So I think about that all the time now. It's really good advice. I wish I could remember her name.
I love that phrase. That everyone write that down if you're a writer. Piper was immediately like, gotta write that.
That was great. Well, survival is definitely an id button.
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, from Connor in the chat, is there any book you don't feel ready to write yet? But
The
that's
last one.
your brain. Your last one.
The last one. No, I mean, I feel like I'm going to be like, I cannot remember his name. Crap. The guy that wrote the Far Side of the World series, the Master and Commander series,
Yeah.
he died before he finished the series, and I feel like that's going to be me. I've actually kind of given instructions to my eldest daughter, Emily, to like, this is what you do. just do this. That way she, stuff can get finished eventually. But yeah, the book that I'm not ready to write will be the final one.
Mm,
There's
That's Valerie.
work in progress that is still in the brain stage, because when I write it, I speed write the first draft. So I write it as fast as I possibly can. But I don't feel as prepared to write it because there isn't magic in it. It's more of a blood and gore situation. And I didn't realize what a easy get out of jail card magic can be versus if you have to play with human limitations. And then Meg and I both actively consume sci-fi and produce fantasy. And I think I can't speak for you, but yeah, I can. I know. I think we'd both like to write sci-fi, but I don't feel ready at all. That's something that I'll probably stick in the fantasy genre for some time.
I think definitely I think about ideas that I want to write, but I don't feel I have the skill yet, which is like, I want to write something, a sci-fi that makes readers feel the same way. I don't know if you guys have read Annihilation, but it's like a really short, it's like a horror, but also it's just really, really well done and really cool and creepy, and it makes you like think. And I want to make readers think and like sit after they finish the book and just like stare for like an hour. But I don't think I have the skill yet. So I'm just writing sort of like adventure stories and romance. But I think one day I will try to write something that's like a little more cerebral.
I love the idea of the goal being, it's not about the story, it's about the despondency you will feel after.
Yes, exactly.
All right. And from Malia in the chat, what are some of your favorite tropes to incorporate into your books? And are there any tropes that you try to avoid?
Oh, I love found family. I think a lot of us, especially in the queer community, can relate to choosing your family. And so that's a really heartwarming trope. And then one of the most elite tropes is like a grumpy man and some guy he decided is his daughter now, like Joel in The Last of Us and Ellie. I love that trope. And I guess Pedro Pascal does that a couple times in his works. He's always just like grumpy man with a child now. So that's one of my favorite tropes.
Really like this thing that's called WUMP. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's WHUMP. It's like a trope that came, this is so nerdy, I'm so sorry, like weird fandom 101. It came from the Stargate fandom because people would write fanfics about one of the characters like getting hurt a lot and he would fall down and the sound of him like hitting the ground is WUMP. The trope is basically like characters getting hurt and like getting like the shit beat out of them. And I have like almost every single one of my books that I've written, some that no one will ever read, like my practice books, like at the end, the male love interest always just gets like beat up and almost dies. And then usually the female protagonist like saves him and saves the day. So that's a trope I didn't like try to write. It's like my favorite thing ever. So it just shows up in all of my books.
Yeah, and that's a cool subversion of a trope too, right? Like the woman coming to the aid of the man instead of the damsel in distress. So it sort of goes both ways there. I love it. Yeah. Joseph, anything to add there?
I think my screen kind of got frozen, but I think I'm still good.
Yeah, you're good.
All right. I would say that I always like the anti-hero trope, honestly. Just because it's more than just the anti-hero, not just like, he's a bad guy or she's a bad, she's an antagonist, but now they have to do something good. It's more of the like, I just really don't want to be bothered. I'm only doing this just to get everybody to leave me alone, to stop annoying me, just to let me do my thing. I just want to have my coffee, read my paper, and be left alone. And as opposed to, the villain turned somewhat hero because of a worse villain type of thing. It's just more of the, kind of like the grumpy old man, but I'm only doing this so everybody would shut up type of thing.
I love it. And I think our last question before we end out is social media important to you? Piper's like, yes. How do you make time for both a social media following and networking on top of focusing on your writing?
Social media is I consider it golden handcuffs, because obviously I'm extremely grateful for the platform that I've built and being able to talk about folklore and how that's enabled me to talk about my books and get them out there. But I would like to not, and I've been really lackadaisical on my TikTok, so I've been more active on Instagram. I just find that Instagram is a safer space, whereas TikTok is all about hitting emotional buttons over and over again and what resonates with people. So I haven't really been making TikToks as often, and now I'm going to try to get back into my regular folklore educational vids. But social media is very important. And when you do market, I recommend doing it like putting a dog's medicine in cheese. So talk about something that they would want to hear about. Like if I'm going to make a folklore video on zombies, and then I'll just mention, I also write this book. And then at the end, like, this is what the book is called. But you trick them into learning about your book.
What a great analogy.
That's amazing. Piper's like the master of social media. I mean, you have to be to have a million followers.
It was an accident. I don't know how it happened. It blew up.
But yeah, I think social media for me is really important in like building a community. It's the only way I've been able to sell books, first of all, which is annoying. Golden handcuffs, where it's like, yay, it lets me sell books, but also I can never leave. So that's annoying. But I've met I met Piper online, and then just so many amazing authors and writers and people in the like the publishing space, especially the indie space. And it's just been so rewarding, and everyone there is very supportive and like helps promote each other's work. And yeah, I think it's really important. Sadly, even if you don't like social media, if you do want to be an author, you got to do it. So I feel blessed that I actually enjoy it and have a whole like friend group on there.
Can I plug something social media real quick? It doesn't benefit me in any way. Just if you have questions about publishing or the industry, there's a channel in my Discord where my agent answers all questions about the industry and publishing, which I think is a very valuable resource. And that's in social media. So it feels like a relevant time. But I have a Discord link in my bio on pretty much every social media platform if you have questions about publishing. Okay, back at you.
Yeah, I agree. It's definitely the community aspect, and it's necessary. And yeah, I'll echo the same thing. It's necessary to sell any books. Without it, I won't sell any. But it's also a struggle because I'm not maybe as witty as others when it comes to posting things, and a lot of from what I have is mostly people who already know me in person, and so they're not buying it from me, so I'm probably not buying it there either. So it's really just for me, it's just a kind of like an outlet to at least form a community, and get some feedback and some tips. There are other writers that I know that are also on various social media platforms, and we all kind of are able to at least like and share each other's work. So it's kind of nice for that too.
Awesome. Well, my friends, Piper, Joe, and Meg, thank you so much for your time. This was absolutely incredible and a lot of fun to hang out with you this morning. And I'm so glad you were a part of Salem Lit Fest 2023. A big shout out to our sponsors, supporters, and partners who help us keep the Lit Fest free for all of you. So the Salem Athenaeum, Salem Public Library, Salem Cultural Council, Peabody Essex Museum, Wicked Good Books, Salem 5 Bank, Copper Dog Books, Cinema Salem, Salem Academy Charter School, the House of the Seven Gables, Salem Maritime National Historic Site, Essex National Heritage, Theater in the Open, and readers like you who have been donating to our festival. And finally, thanks to you, our audience members, for being here, for asking really great questions and supporting these awesome authors. Buy their books. And if you are so inclined, you can purchase our authors' books at our sponsor, Wicked Good Books, here in Salem, Copper Dog Books in Beverly, or from your favorite booksellers. Next, to round out our festival, is Enduring Hawthorne, and that is actually happening at the House of the Seven Gables. Watch as a curated selection of Hawthorne's most famous short stories come to life. Guests will be treated to 4 stories, each played out in a different historic setting, and we hope to see you there. Have a great rest of your day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. And authors, we can pop backstage if you want.